Let's talk some human population growth. This is section 5.3 in your textbook. So, humans have a pretty big reproductive capacity at the moment. Um, at the beginning of time, when there were only a few humans on Earth, we saw really slow growth. It was tough back then on Earth, right? So there wasn't necessarily a grocery store to get your food at or a hospital to get health care at. Life was pretty tough. So your life expectancy probably wasn't high. And so it was difficult for the population to grow quickly. But over time, the population did grow, connected to some really important events like agriculture, access to health care, things like education. All of these things impact how humans patternistically grow in terms of population. So, one piece of information you just want to remind yourself is that population growth is determined by subtracting the number of deaths from the number of births for whatever period of time you're talking about. So, that's the actual change in the population for the period of time that you're interested in. And one of the questions that we might want to ask ourselves is, what is Earth's carrying capacity for humans? And the short answer to that is, we don't know. And the longer answer to that is, we might be reaching it. But there's a lot of pieces there. So let's take a peek and just look at this graph. So you can see this depicts the human population on Earth going back a really long time ago, but let's focus right around here, a few thousand years before Christ. And if you go all the way to here, you can see it's not a huge change, right? A little bit, we start to see a little bit of increase in population right here. And then there's this blip, which maybe in this graph doesn't look that significant, but actually it was quite significant. It really made quite a ding in the total human population. And that was, of course, the Black Death or the plague. And then you can see after that there was a recovery and subsequent explosion of the human population. And so this is essentially making a perfect J curve. So we have that exponential growth that we talked about earlier, and it's continuing. If you look way up here at the top, there's the tiniest little indication that maybe it's starting to curve over. It might be starting to slow. And so it's hard to know yet. Maybe this is gonna turn into an S curve and look very logistic, or maybe we're gonna see sort of a boom and bust cycle. Again, hard to know for sure. So the thing about exponential growth is that it can't go on forever, because we talked about limiting factors earlier, and in order for exponential growth to occur, there has to be enough of all the required factors for life for all of those individuals, whether it's food, shelter, and then also you have the density dependent limiting factors like disease. So exponential growth doesn't go on forever. This guy named Malthus, he was kind of a famous philosopher slash economist back in the olden days, and he talked a lot about this concept. And his idea was that there weren't enough resources for all humans on Earth. And in fact, that's how he supported the argument for feudalism. And basically his thing was there's not enough resources, so the aristocracy should get the majority of the resources, and the peasantry will have to make do, and as a result there will be high numbers of deaths among the peasantry. But he identified three major factors that might limit human population: things like war, things like famine, and things like disease. And if you think about those three factors, they do tend to preferentially impact his peasant class, as he referred to it, versus the aristocracy at the time when he lived. What's also really important about Malthus, and this will come up again, is that his thinking was a major influence on Darwin, because it turns out in nature, right, there are limiting factors. Individuals have to compete for the resources that they need, and that's where Darwin got this idea for his theory of natural selection and the mechanism by which evolution might occur. So this will come back to us again. Okay, another thing about population growth that we like to look at are age structure diagrams. These diagrams allow us to make predictions about population growth, but you do have to be careful because some things can change between when you create the age structure diagram and the subsequent future prediction. So we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's take a peek at two ways of looking at the data. And I'm just going to switch over to this website and let's see if I can get this lined up. So here's one way of looking at data. This is an age structure diagram. This is at populationpyramid.net if you want to visit. And you can view the population pyramid for any country that you like. So I can click on D here and we can see what Denmark looks like, and there, ooh, very interesting. Notice how it's narrower at the bottom than it is sort of up here in this area, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this gives you a very quick sense, right, of what a population looks like. So the youngest people are down here, and it gets progressively older as you go up, and there's males on the left and females on the right, so you can very quickly get a sense of who makes up the population of this country. On the other hand, the CIA, they prefer to do it old school, so they just list it like this. So yeah, you have to do a lot of thinking and visualization to get a sense of what any of this means. So I think this is a great example of where graphing can be really beneficial. It really lets people see trends quickly instead of having to read a whole bunch and then having to decipher all that and create a visualization of it inside your head. So if we go back to our, oops, sorry about that. If we go back here, there's our structure diagram. Now let's see, let's take a peek at Kenya. So there's Kenya. Oh, look at that. It's like a beautiful triangle. There are lots of young people. And it turns out that really matters because lots of little kids means that pretty soon they're going to enter their reproductive age and they're going to be able to have kids. So if there's lots of young people, that would suggest that your population is going to grow quite rapidly. On the other hand, okay, I just have to point out, I have never heard of the country of Kiribati. Got to click on it. Interesting. Something fascinating going on there. All right, but let's get back to Denmark. If we look at Denmark, there's not as many young people, right? There's fewer and fewer really young people, which means going forward, there'll be fewer and fewer people having children. So unlike Kenya, which is probably going to increase rapidly in terms of population size, Denmark is probably shrinking, or at the very least stable, but it looks to me like it might be shrinking. All right, so let's get back here. So that's two different ways that we can look at the data. Now, here's one example. This is the US. Now you can see this was actually back in 2000. Some of these are a little old, but this is what we would consider stable growth because in the age, this is probably going up to about 45 right here, and then these people are getting older, sorry, right here. 55 right here, and then 45 right there on the yellow. So you can see we don't have lots of young people that are about to have kids, so our population is pretty much staying the same. Immigration impacts our population more than in-house births. Here's again an example. This is Kenya, and it has that nice pyramid shape, lots of little young people, so they're going to have lots of kids, most likely, assuming war, famine, or disease doesn't break out, and preferentially impact younger people, which could then very much impact the population growth. And here's one, Italy, where you can see there's way fewer young people than there are 20 and up, which means they are not going to be replacing the population as they get older and eventually die. So this population is experiencing negative growth. There's some really interesting things about Italy and why women are having fewer children, and I am not making this up. It has to do with the fact that boys in Italy are more likely to live at home because real estate is expensive and difficult to come by, and today's Italian woman is pretty well educated and not interested in moving in with a man and his parents, and so it has really put women off of marriage and childbearing in Italy, and that's one of a number of factors that's impacting population growth in Italy. Something else you need to know about is the demographic transition. If you're in AP Human Geo or Human Geo, you might have heard of this already. So the demographic transition, which I'll show you in one sec, is going to show us how humans go through these different stages that are connected to industrialization, healthcare, and technology. And what we're going to really see is how the birth rates and death rates for developed countries are going to be pretty low, whereas birth rates and death rates for developing countries could be quite high or a mix. You may have a high, as you get further in your demographic transition, you can sometimes see a reduction in birth rates, but still a high death rate, or vice versa. But let's take a peek here at this diagram. So here you see phase 1 of demographic transition, where you see a very high birth rate and also a pretty high death rate. It does fluctuate a little bit, but essentially they are both high. And then in phase 2, you start to see both birth rates and death rates start to fall, but the death rate is falling much faster than the birth rate, so populations tend to increase in number here. And then in phase 3, you see the birth rate really starting to get low and almost equaling the death rate. So that means we get this stable population growth. And in phase 4, we have very low birth rates, sometimes not replacement rate, and also very low death rates. People are living a long time. And so you see this down here. Now in AP Human Geo, I feel like they might have a 5th phase, but we don't do that in biology. So just be aware of that if you're in AP Human Geo. It's not wrong or right, it's just different across disciplines. So geography is a little bit different than biology. So that might leave you asking the question, well, how many people are there going to be in the future? So the estimates are as many as 10 million by 2050, which is not that far from now. But the growth rate is slowing down, but there's so many of us that even with just a tiny growth rate, like 1% or 0.5% of 10 billion people, by the way, that should not say a million, that should say a billion. I hope you caught that. That should be a billion. Just a 0.5% of 10 billion people is a lot of millions of people that we're still adding to this planet Earth. So we're still going to see population growth rate even as the growth rate shrinks. We're going to see an increase in the number of people on planet Earth.